My daughter-in-law banned me from my own grandson's 5th birthday party in her house. What she forgot was that I paid the $120 our dollars down payment that made that house possible in the first place. My name is Evelyn Torres. I'm 75 years old, and I've learned something important in these 7 decades on this earth. People will take your generosity and twist it into their own narrative when it suits them. They'll accept your help with grateful smiles, then slam doors in your face when you've served your purpose. And sometimes, the people who hurt you most are the ones you helped the most. For 7 years now, I've been a widow. My Robert ran a successful automotive dealership for 40 years before cancer took him from me in 2018. He left me comfortable, $1, $3 million in assets, solid retirement accounts, and the kind of financial security that lets you sleep at night. We worked hard for every penny, and we were always generous with our only son, Marcus. When Marcus married Jessica 9 years ago, I wanted to help them start their life together. Young couples today face a housing market that would have made my generation weep. So when they were house hunting in 2019, struggling to compete with cash buyers and investors, I made them an offer. I'd pay their down payment, all $120, $100 of it, as a gift, as a mother's love made tangible. Marcus cried when I told him. Jessica hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, thanking me over and over. The house went into both their names exactly as it should have. I never mentioned that money again. It wasn't a loan. It was a gift from a mother to her son and his wife. I thought that generosity had bought me a place in their family forever. I was wrong. If you want to hear how a 75-year-old grandmother taught her daughter-in-law an unforgettable lesson about respect, stay with me and hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started. The change in Jessica didn't happen overnight. That's the thing about manipulation. It creeps in slowly, like water damage behind a wall. You don't notice it until the structure is already compromised. For the first few years after they bought the house, everything seemed fine. I'd visit on weekends, bring groceries, help Jessica with the garden she was trying to start in the backyard. When Lucas was born 6 years ago, I was in the delivery room. I held my grandson 10 minutes after he entered this world, and I felt my Robert's spirit there with us, wishing he could have met this beautiful boy. I became the grandmother I'd always dreamed of being. Every Wednesday, I'd pick Lucas up from preschool and take him to the park. We'd feed the ducks, get ice cream, and he'd tell me stories that only made sense in the magical logic of a child's mind. I'd read him books at bedtime when I stayed for dinner. I taught him to recognize birds, cardinals, blue jays, robins, simple pleasures that money can't buy. But about 2 years ago, I started noticing the comments. Small things at first. I'd be helping in the kitchen during Sunday dinners, and Jessica would say that in her house, she preferred things organized a certain way. I'd suggest a different pediatrician when Lucas had that persistent cough, and she'd remind me that her son's health care was her decision. I'd arrive for my Wednesday pickup, and she'd mention that maybe I should text before coming over to their home. Their home, her house, her kitchen, her son. Possessive pronouns became her favorite weapons, each one a tiny blade cutting away at my place in this family I'd helped build. Marcus never said a word in my defense. My son, who I'd raised to stand up for what's right, would just stare at his plate and shovel food into his mouth while his wife slowly erased his mother from their lives. That cowardice hurt almost as much as Jessica's hostility. The incidents escalated. I'd bring Lucas a toy, and Jessica would tell me I was spoiling him, that I needed to ask permission before buying things for her child. I'd share a recipe that had been in our family for generations, and she'd inform me that they were trying new approaches to nutrition, implying my cooking was somehow inadequate. Once, I used my own key, the one Marcus had given me years ago, to drop off birthday presents while they were out, and Jessica changed the locks the next week. I felt it happening, this slow exclusion, but I told myself I was being sensitive. Maybe it was just the stress of parenthood. Maybe Jessica was overwhelmed. Maybe I was being the interfering mother-in-law from every bad sitcom, and I just couldn't see it. Then came the phone call that shattered any illusions I had left. Last week, I called to ask about the details for Lucas's 5th birthday party. What time should I arrive? Did they need me to bring anything? Should I arrange for a cake from that bakery Lucas loves? Simple grandmother questions about a celebration I'd never missed. Jessica's voice on the other end of the line was cold enough to frost glass. She told me they'd decided to make it a nuclear family celebration this year. Small, intimate, just the 3 of them. She was sure I'd understand. I told her I didn't understand at all. I'm his grandmother. Nuclear family includes me. I've been at every single birthday since he was born. I'm not some distant relative who sends cards once a year. I'm part of his daily life. That's when Jessica dropped the mask entirely. She sighed, that particular sigh that people use when they're exhausted by your very existence, and told me I was suffocating, that I was always interfering, always giving my opinions when nobody asked for them, always showing up unannounced even though she'd asked me repeatedly to respect boundaries. Then she said the words, "I'll never forget. This is my house, my family, my son. You are not invited." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there in my living room, the same room where Robert and I had celebrated 42 anniversaries, where we'd opened Christmas presents with young Marcus, where we'd built a life of love and generosity, and I felt something I hadn't felt in all my 75 years. Not just hurt, not just anger. Something colder and more calculating than either of those emotions. Clarity. I looked around at the home Robert and I had built together, at the comfortable life his hard work had provided, at the financial security that let me help others without a second thought. And I realized that Jessica had made a crucial miscalculation. She thought my generosity was weakness. She thought my age made me powerless. She thought that because I was a grandmother, I'd simply accept whatever crumbs of access to my grandson she decided to toss my way. That night, I picked up the phone and called Kenneth Morrison, the attorney who'd handled our family's legal matters for 30 years. I asked him a simple question. Did I have documentation proving I'd paid that $120, $1,000 down payment? Kenneth confirmed that everything was thoroughly documented. Bank transfers, emails from the time of purchase, everything a court would need to see. Then he asked me why I was asking. That's when I decided to remind Jessica exactly who had made her perfect little house possible. I told Kenneth everything. Every dismissive comment, every boundary that felt less like healthy space and more like exile. Every time Jessica had weaponized the word "my" to push me further away from my own grandson. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, letting me empty 7 decades of dignity onto his desk. When I finished, Kenneth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made my heart skip. Technically, the down payment had been a gift, so I had no legal claim to the house itself, but there might be other angles to explore. He asked me to give him a few days to review all the documents from the purchase. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept replaying Jessica's words in my mind, that cold dismissal, that casual cruelty. But I also kept thinking about something Robert used to say. The people who underestimate you give you your greatest advantage. They stop watching. They stop being careful. Jessica thought she'd put me in my place. She had no idea she'd just awakened something in me I didn't even know was there. 3 days later, Kenneth called me back, and I could hear something in his voice that made me sit up straighter in my chair. He told me he'd found something interesting in the original purchase documents, something I'd completely forgotten about in the 6 years since Robert passed. The deed had a clause, a specific provision that Robert had insisted on including when we made that gift. My husband had always been protective, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The clause stated that if Marcus and Jessica ever divorced, I would have the right of first refusal to buy back the house for the original down payment amount of $120 or dollars, protecting what Kenneth called my family investment. At the time, I'd thought Robert was being unnecessarily cautious. Marcus and Jessica were newlyweds, madly in love, planning their future. Why would we need a divorce clause? But Robert had seen something I hadn't. Or maybe he'd just lived long enough to know that love and gratitude have expiration dates for some people. I sat there holding the phone, and for the first time since that horrible call with Jessica, I smiled. I wasn't planning to invoke the clause. Marcus and Jessica weren't divorcing as far as I knew. But the existence of that clause changed everything. It was proof, legal and binding, that this wasn't just Jessica's house. My investment came with strings, whether she knew it or not. Kenneth suggested sending a carefully worded letter to both Marcus and Jessica. Nothing threatening, nothing that would make me look like the villain. Just a gentle reminder of the generous gift that had made their home ownership possible. A mention of the protective clauses Robert had wisely included, and an expression of concern about the deteriorating family relationships that had motivated such generosity in the first place. I thought about it for exactly 10 seconds before I told him to draft it. While Kenneth worked on the letter, I did some investigating of my own. I went through my files. Yes, I still keep paper records, organized in the filing system Robert set up decades ago, and pulled out every document related to that house purchase. Bank statements showing the $120 transfer. Emails from Jessica, thanking me profusely, calling me the most generous mother-in-law in the world, saying she'd never forget what I'd done for them. Text messages from Marcus, telling me I'd changed their lives, that he'd spend the rest of his days making me proud. I made copies of everything. At 75, I've learned that people's memories become remarkably selective when it serves their purposes. But paper doesn't lie. Digital records don't forget. Then I started looking deeper into their financial situation. Not because I'm nosy, but because I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Marcus had always been somewhat open with me about their finances. Not in detail, but enough that I knew they were comfortable, but not wealthy. Jessica's job in marketing paid decently. Marcus worked in IT project management. Together, they were solidly middle class. But that house? In our neighborhood, it was worth close to $650,000 now. The appreciation alone represented over $150,000 in equity they'd gained in just 6 years, all built on the foundation of my $120 gift. Without that down payment, they'd still be renting a 2-bedroom apartment across town, nowhere near the good school district Lucas was now attending. I pulled up the county property records online. Yes, this grandmother knows how to use a computer. Thank you very much. And confirmed what I already knew. The house was in both their names. My name appeared nowhere on the deed. Legally, I owned nothing. But legally and morally are two very different things. And practically? Well, that's where Kenneth's letter came in. When the draft arrived in my email, I read it 3 times. It was perfect, polite, factual, and subtly devastating. It reminded them of my generous $120 down payment gift that enabled the purchase. It mentioned the right of first refusal clause protecting the Torres family investment. And it expressed concern about the deterioration of family relationships that originally motivated such substantial generosity, suggesting that perhaps a respectful reconciliation, appropriate to functional families, might be in order. Kenneth sent it by certified mail, requiring signature. I wanted Jessica to have to sign for it herself, to physically acknowledge receiving this reminder of who had really made her precious house possible. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Jessica, and I could hear the fear underneath the anger in her voice. Jessica's voice was tight when she asked me if the letter from my attorney was some kind of threat. I could picture her standing in that beautiful kitchen with the granite countertops, the kitchen that existed because of my money, clutching Kenneth's letter in her hand, finally understanding that she'd made a serious miscalculation. I kept my voice calm, almost sweet. The tone I'd perfected over decades of dealing with difficult people while volunteering at the hospital auxiliary, serving on the HOA board, navigating the social circles of Robert's business world. The tone that makes people underestimate you right before you prove them wrong. I told her it wasn't a threat at all. It was simply a reminder. She'd made it very clear that it was her house, and I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page about the facts. Technically, $120, $1,000 of that house was mine, and families who truly respect each other don't ban grandmothers from their grandchildren's birthday parties. The silence on the other end was delicious. I could practically hear her recalculating, reassessing, realizing that the harmless old woman she'd been dismissing wasn't quite as harmless as she'd thought. She started to backtrack immediately. She told me I'd misunderstood, that she'd been having a bad day when we last spoke, that she was stressed about party planning and had overreacted. The words tumbled out fast, tripping over each other in her rush to undo the damage. I let her talk. I've learned that sometimes the best response is silence. Let people fill the void with their own anxiety, their own guilty justifications. Every word she spoke just confirmed what I already knew. She'd gotten comfortable taking me for granted, and the letter had scared her. She suggested maybe we could talk about this in person, just the two of us, perhaps over coffee. She was sure we could work everything out like adults. After all, we were family. Family. The word she'd used like a weapon just days ago was suddenly supposed to be a bridge. I told her I'd think about it and let her know. Then I ended the call, leaving her hanging, uncertain. At 75 years old, I've earned the right to make people wait for my decisions. Marcus called an hour later. My son's voice was embarrassed, apologetic, everything it should have been a year ago when this all started. He told me he hadn't known Jessica said those things to me, that of course I was invited to Lucas's party, that I was always welcome in their home. But here's what Marcus didn't understand, and what I couldn't quite bring myself to explain to him. The damage wasn't in one phone call. It was in 2 years of watching him say nothing while his wife systematically pushed me out of their lives. It was in his silence every time Jessica made those possessive comments, every time she drew boundaries that felt more like walls. I told him I appreciated the call, but that I wasn't interested in pity invitations. I wanted respect, not charity. Jessica had made her feelings abundantly clear, and I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine just because a lawyer's letter had frightened her into temporary courtesy. Marcus tried to argue, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew I was right. He'd been a coward, and we both knew it. Over the next few days, I noticed something interesting. My phone started ringing more frequently. Jessica called twice more, each time a little more anxious, a little more conciliatory. She asked if I needed anything, if I wanted to come over for dinner, if I'd like to take Lucas to the park like I used to. I accepted one dinner invitation. I wanted to see my grandson, and I wanted to watch Jessica pretend everything was normal. I wanted to observe how they behaved now that they understood I wasn't just a passive bank account with a pulse. The dinner was excruciating in its forced cheerfulness. Jessica was overly attentive, offering me the best chair, asking repeatedly if the food was too salty or too bland, commenting on how wonderful it was to have me there. Marcus kept looking between us nervously, like a child worried his divorced parents might start fighting at his birthday party. Lucas, bless his innocent heart, was just happy to see his grandmother. He showed me his new drawings, told me about his friend's pet hamster, asked when we could go feed the ducks again. In his 5-year-old world, nothing had changed. He had no idea his mother had tried to erase me from his life. I played along beautifully. I smiled, I thanked Jessica for the lovely meal, I complimented her hosting. I was the perfect picture of the sweet elderly grandmother, gracious and forgiving. But I watched everything. I noticed how Jessica's smile never quite reached her eyes. I saw how she touched my arm a little too often, as if physical contact could rebuild trust. I observed Marcus's relief that I wasn't causing a scene, his desperate hope that this mess would just resolve itself without him having to actually take a stand. And I realized something important. Jessica thought the letter had worked. She thought I'd been placated. She believed that a few kind words and a dinner invitation had put the troublesome old woman back in her place. Grateful for scraps. Asking for nothing, causing no problems. She had no idea that I was just getting started. The birthday party happened 3 days after that uncomfortable dinner. I decided not to attend. I know that might sound petty, like I was punishing my grandson for his mother's behavior. But here's what I've learned in 75 years. Sometimes you have to make a painful choice to establish a principle. If I'd shown up after being uninvited, then grudgingly re-invited only because of a lawyer's letter, I would have been teaching everyone, including Lucas, that Grandma can be treated any way they like, and she'll still come running with a smile. That's not the lesson I wanted to leave behind. Instead, I did something else. I ordered the bicycle Lucas had been begging for, a beautiful red one with training wheels and a bell. I had it delivered directly to their house the morning of the party with a card that read, "To my darling Lucas, on your 5th birthday. Grandma loves you always. When you're older, I'll explain why I couldn't be there today. Love, Grandma Evelyn." I wanted that bike sitting in their garage, wanted them to see it every single day, a bright red reminder of what Jessica's cruelty had cost. Jessica called me that evening after the party. She was crying, telling me how hurt Lucas had been that I wasn't there, how he kept asking where Grandma was, how she'd had to make up some excuse about me being sick. She begged me to reconsider whatever it was I was doing, to please not punish her child for her mistakes. Her child. Still possessive, even in her apology. I told her the truth. I wasn't punishing Lucas. I was protecting my dignity. And if she wanted me back in their lives, she was going to have to do better than scared phone calls and forced dinner invitations. She was going to have to actually change how she treated me. But I didn't really believe she would change. People like Jessica don't transform because of one scare. They adjust their tactics. They become more subtle. They wait until the threat passes, and then they go right back to who they really are. So I made an appointment with Kenneth for the following week. It was time to make some changes to my estate plan. When I sat down in Kenneth's office, I had my priorities clear. I told him I wanted to revise my will, and I wanted to do it in a way that protected Lucas while sending an unmistakable message about respect. Kenneth pulled up my current will on his computer. Most of my estate was set to go to Marcus, with smaller bequests to charities Robert and I had supported over the years. Standard stuff for a widow with one child. I told Kenneth that Marcus could still inherit the bulk of my estate. He was my son, and despite his weakness in standing up to his wife, I still loved him. But Jessica would receive nothing directly, not a single dollar, not a piece of jewelry, not even a photo album. More importantly, I wanted to establish a trust fund for Lucas's education. I had $200, 000. I'd been planning to leave directly to Marcus for Lucas's future. Instead, I wanted it placed in an irrevocable trust, controlled by Kenneth, with strict provisions. The money could only be used for Lucas's education, tuition, books, housing, reasonable expenses. Marcus and Jessica would have no access to withdraw funds for any other purpose. Lucas would get whatever remained when he turned 25. Kenneth made notes, nodding. Then he asked me if I was sure about this. These kinds of trusts sent a message that I didn't trust my own son. I told him he was exactly right. I didn't trust my son. Marcus had proven he'd choose peace with his wife over defending his mother. What would stop him from letting Jessica pressure him into using Lucas's education fund for a kitchen remodel or a vacation? The trust wasn't punishment. It was protection. But there was something else I wanted Kenneth to explore, something that had been nagging at me since that first phone call with Jessica. I asked him to look into their financial situation more thoroughly. Not because I wanted to control them, but because I needed to understand what was really driving Jessica's behavior. Kenneth had connections, credit agencies, public records, professional networks. Within a week, he called me back with information that made everything click into place. Marcus and Jessica were struggling financially. Not drastically, not losing the house struggling, but definitely feeling squeezed. Jessica's company had restructured 6 months ago, eliminating her annual bonus, about $15 she'd been counting on. Marcus had been passed over for a promotion he'd expected. They'd refinanced the house last year to pay off credit card debt, and now they were carrying a larger mortgage payment. And here's the part that made my blood run cold. Kenneth had discovered they'd been researching reverse mortgages and home equity lines of credit. They were looking at ways to extract money from the house built on my $120 $1,000 foundation. Suddenly, Jessica's hostility made perfect sense. She didn't just want me out of their lives because I was inconvenient or interfering. She wanted me out because I was a reminder of what they owed. Every time she saw me, she saw that $120,000 she and Marcus didn't have to scrape together. She saw the difference between their actual success and the success my generosity had purchased for them. And if I wasn't around, if I was just a distant grandmother who sent birthday cards and stayed out of the way, it would be so much easier to think of that house as entirely theirs. So much easier to leverage it, borrow against it, treat it like their own achievement instead of what it really was, a gift they'd never properly appreciated. That's when I realized Jessica's cruelty wasn't personal. It was financial. Understanding Jessica's motivation changed everything. This wasn't about personality conflicts or boundary issues or mother-in-law stereotypes. This was about money, plain and simple. She resented my generosity because it made her feel indebted, and people will do terrible things to escape the weight of gratitude they never wanted to carry. I spent the next week thinking carefully about my next move. At 75, I don't have the luxury of wasting time on strategies that won't work. Every decision has to count. I called Kenneth again and asked him to do something specific. I wanted him to file a notice with the county recorder's office. Not a lien exactly, but a formal declaration of my interest in the property based on that right of first refusal clause. It wouldn't affect their ability to live there or even refinance under normal circumstances, but it would show up on any title search. If they tried to sell the house or take out a significant home equity loan, my claim would be right there in the public record. Kenneth warned me this was aggressive. It would essentially put a cloud on their title, make lenders nervous, complicate any major financial moves they wanted to make with the property. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to go this far. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. The filing went through on a Tuesday. Kenneth called me that Friday to let me know that Marcus had contacted him, frantically asking what this meant and how to get it removed. Kenneth had calmly explained that it was simply a formal acknowledgement of the clause already in the deed, protecting my family investment. Nothing illegal, nothing improper. Just making sure everyone understood the terms of the original arrangement. Marcus showed up at my door that Sunday afternoon. My son, who hadn't visited me in 3 months despite living 20 minutes away, was suddenly on my doorstep looking exhausted and defeated. He told me they couldn't refinance. The bank had pulled their application when the title search revealed my filing. They couldn't access the equity in their home, couldn't get the cash they desperately needed to cover some expenses. He didn't specify what expenses, but I could guess. Credit cards, probably. Maybe some other debts they'd been hiding. I invited him in for coffee, made it the way he liked it, with too much cream and sugar, the way I'd been making it for him since he was 16 and discovered caffeine. We sat in my kitchen, and for the first time in years, Marcus actually talked to me honestly. He told me things had been harder than he'd let on. Jessica's job situation was worse than I'd known. She was worried about layoffs. He'd been picking up contract work on the side just to keep up with their bills. The house, the beautiful house in the good neighborhood with the excellent schools, was eating them alive with property taxes, maintenance, the mortgage payment after the refinance. And yes, they'd been counting on pulling equity out to give themselves breathing room. My filing had blocked that plan completely. I listened without interrupting, the way I'd wished he'd listened to me when I tried to tell him how Jessica was treating me. When he finished, I asked him a simple question. Did he think it was fair that his mother, who'd made their home ownership possible, should be banned from her grandson's birthday party? Marcus looked down at his coffee cup. He admitted Jessica had been wrong. He admitted he should have defended me. He said he'd been trying to keep the peace, trying to hold his marriage together, And somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that peace built on injustice isn't really peace at all. I told him something I'd been holding back for 2 years. I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me. The Marcus I'd raised would never have let anyone disrespect his mother the way Jessica had. The Marcus I'd raised understood that loyalty flows both ways, that you don't stay silent when someone you love is being hurt. He started crying. My 42-year-old son sat at my kitchen table and cried like he used to when he was a little boy and had done something wrong. He apologized over and over, said he'd been a coward, said he'd fix it. But I was past the point of easy forgiveness. I told him the filing would stay in place. I told him my revised will was already signed and witnessed, with Lucas's education protected in a trust they couldn't touch. I told him that if he wanted to repair our relationship, it couldn't just be words, it had to be action, consistent and sustained. Then I told him something that surprised even me. I wasn't trying to destroy their financial stability. I was trying to teach them, teach Jessica especially, that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people like disposable conveniences and expect them to keep opening their wallets and their hearts. Marcus asked me what he needed to do to make this right. I told him the truth. I didn't know yet, but it would start with him finding his spine and remembering that protecting your marriage doesn't mean sacrificing your mother. He left an hour later, and I watched him drive away from my window. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not victory exactly, but something close to it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just reacting to their cruelty. I was controlling the situation. The weeks after Marcus's visit were strange. I'd expected silence, or perhaps another angry confrontation from Jessica. Instead, I got something I hadn't anticipated: genuine effort. Marcus started coming by every Sunday morning. Just him, no Jessica, no Lucas at first. He'd bring coffee from the shop I liked, and we'd sit on my back porch talking about everything and nothing. He told me about work frustrations, about old friends he'd reconnected with, about the vegetable garden he was trying to start in their backyard. Small talk mostly, but underneath it was something more important: presence, consistency, the slow rebuilding of trust that had been shattered. After the third Sunday, he brought Lucas with him. My grandson ran into my arms like no time had passed at all, chattering about kindergarten and his new bike and the robin's nest he'd found in their oak tree. We spent the afternoon in my garden, and I taught him the names of the plants like I'd been wanting to do for months. Jessica didn't come. Marcus said she was giving us space, respecting the boundary I'd drawn. I suspected she just couldn't face me yet, but I appreciated the distance regardless. I kept my guard up, though. I've lived long enough to know that people can maintain good behavior for a few weeks when they're motivated by fear or guilt. The real test would be whether it lasted once the immediate crisis faded from their minds. Kenneth called me in early November with interesting news. He'd been monitoring the public records, more out of professional habit than necessity, and noticed that Marcus and Jessica had listed their house for sale. They were moving. When Marcus came by that Sunday, I asked him about it directly. He looked uncomfortable but didn't try to hide it. He told me they'd made a decision. The house was too much for them financially, and emotionally, it had become complicated. They'd found a smaller place in a nearby town, still in a good school district, but more affordable. The sale of the current house would let them pay off their debts and start fresh. He said it wasn't because of me, wasn't because of the filing, but I could see in his eyes that wasn't entirely true. My legal maneuver had forced them to confront reality. They couldn't access the equity, couldn't keep struggling to maintain a lifestyle built on my foundation, couldn't pretend indefinitely that everything was fine. I asked him how Jessica felt about this. He was quiet for a long moment, then admitted she'd been devastated at first. That house had been her dream, her proof that she'd made it, her symbol of success. Leaving it felt like failure. But he said something else, too. The decision to move had actually helped their marriage. They'd stopped fighting about money constantly. They'd stopped resenting the burden of maintaining appearances. Jessica had even admitted to him that she'd been wrong about how she treated me, that her own insecurity about accepting help had turned into something ugly. I didn't entirely believe in this sudden transformation, but I recognized that sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can start climbing back up. Losing that house, or rather choosing to let it go, might be Jessica's bottom. The house sold quickly in early December. Marcus kept me updated throughout the process. And I noticed something important. He started consulting me again. Not about every little thing, but about big decisions. Should they take the first offer or wait? What did I think about the neighborhood they were considering? Could I look over their new mortgage documents before they signed? It reminded me of how things used to be when I was his mother first and Jessica's adversary never. Their closing date was set for January 15th. Because of the right of first refusal clause, Kenneth had to officially waive my option to purchase the property at the original down payment amount. It was a formality. I had no interest in buying their house, but it required my signature on legal documents. When Kenneth brought me the paperwork, I sat looking at it for a long time. This was my leverage, my power, my proof that I wasn't just a helpless old woman who could be dismissed and forgotten. Signing these papers would release it forever. But I realized something important. I didn't need the power anymore. The point had been made. The lesson had been learned. Marcus had found his spine again. Jessica had been humbled by reality. And I had proven to myself and to them that generosity without respect is a gift that can be withdrawn. I signed the papers. The day of their closing, I did something I hadn't planned. I wrote a check for $25,000 and delivered it to their new address with a note. For Lucas's bedroom furniture and a fresh start. With love, Mom. Marcus called me crying for the second time in 3 months. He told me I didn't have to do this, that they didn't deserve it, that Jessica was sobbing in their new empty living room because she couldn't believe I'd still help them after everything. I told him something Robert used to say, family isn't about keeping score. It's about knowing when to hold firm and when to extend grace. I'd held firm when I needed to. Now it was time for grace. But I also told him this. The next time Jessica or anyone else treated me like I was disposable, there wouldn't be a second chance. I'd learned I could stand up for myself, and that knowledge wasn't going anywhere. Tomorrow was Marcus's 43rd birthday, and I'd planned something they weren't expecting. Marcus's birthday fell on a Saturday. I'd told him I wanted to take him, Jessica, and Lucas out to dinner at Marcello's, the Italian restaurant where Robert and I had celebrated every important family milestone for 30 years. The owner, Tony, still remembered us, still kept our favorite corner table available when I called ahead. Marcus seemed surprised by the invitation, surprised that I wanted Jessica there, surprised that I was initiating a family gathering after months of tension. But he accepted immediately, relief evident in his voice. I arrived at the restaurant early and asked Tony for a favor. He knew our family's history, had watched Marcus grow from a boy to a man at these very tables. When I explained what I needed, he smiled and nodded, understanding immediately. They arrived 15 minutes later. Jessica looked nervous, dressed carefully as if she was attending a job interview rather than a family dinner. Lucas ran to hug me, and I held my grandson tight, breathing in that little boy's smell of shampoo and grass stains and pure innocence. We settled into our seats, and the evening started awkwardly. Jessica was overly polite, complimenting everything, my dress, the restaurant choice, the bread basket. Marcus kept trying to fill silences with cheerful observations about their new house. Only Lucas was natural, coloring on the paper menu and telling me elaborate stories about his kindergarten class. After we ordered, I asked Tony to bring something I'd prepared earlier. He returned with a large envelope and a small wrapped box, placing them in front of Marcus. Marcus looked confused. He told me he wasn't expecting gifts, that dinner was more than enough. I smiled and told him to open the envelope first. Inside were copies of the original documents from the house purchase, the emails where Jessica had thanked me profusely, calling me the most generous person she'd ever known. The bank transfer records showing the $120,000, the deed with Robert's protective clause. And finally, the release documents I'd signed allowing their house sale to proceed without claiming my right of first refusal. Marcus looked through them slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like shame. Jessica had gone pale, staring at the papers like they might bite her. I told them I wanted them to keep these documents, not as a reminder of what they owed me, but as a reminder of something more important. Family history matters. Actions have consequences, but they also have context. That $120,000 wasn't just money. It was Robert's legacy, his way of taking care of his son even after death. It was my way of showing love. And it deserved to be remembered with respect, not resentment. Jessica's eyes were filling with tears. She started to apologize again, but I held up my hand. I told her I didn't want another apology. I wanted her to understand something she'd clearly never learned. Accepting help isn't weakness. Being grateful isn't the same as being indebted. And treating people with kindness isn't optional just because you feel insecure about what they've done for you. Then I asked Marcus to open the box. Inside was a key, the key to a storage unit I'd rented. I explained that over the past 2 months, I'd been going through my house, boxing up things I wanted Lucas to have someday. Robert's old tools. Because every boy should learn to build things with his grandfather's hammers. Photo albums from Marcus's childhood, so Lucas could see his father as a gap-toothed kid with scraped knees. My mother's recipes, handwritten in the margins of an old cookbook, because family traditions are worth preserving. I told them the storage unit was paid for 5 years in advance. When Lucas was old enough to appreciate these things, they could give him the key and let him explore his family history. But here's what I didn't tell them immediately. I'd also placed something else in that storage unit. A sealed letter addressed to Lucas, to be given to him on his 18th birthday. In it, I'd written the whole story, not to turn him against his mother, but to teach him something important about how we treat the people who love us. Marcus was crying openly now. He told me he didn't deserve this, didn't deserve my continued generosity after how badly he'd failed me. I told him something I'd realized over these difficult months. Deserving has nothing to do with it. Love isn't a transaction. It's a choice you make every day, even when it's hard, even when people disappoint you. Then, I turned to Jessica directly. I told her I forgave her, not because she'd earned it, but because carrying anger was exhausting and I was too old to waste my remaining years on bitterness. But I also told her that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I would never forget how easily she'd discarded me when I became inconvenient. And I would be watching, carefully, to see if this new humility was real or just another performance. Jessica finally spoke, her voice shaking. She told me she'd been jealous. Jealous of how easily I'd given what she and Marcus had struggled for. Jealous of my financial security when they were drowning. Jealous of my relationship with Lucas because she felt like she was failing as a mother. She'd turned that jealousy into cruelty because it was easier than admitting her own insecurity. It was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. The table fell silent, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted between us. That was 8 months ago. It's September now, and I'm sitting in my garden watching the late afternoon sun paint everything gold. Lucas is here with me, carefully watering the tomato plants we started together back in spring. In a few minutes, Marcus and Jessica will arrive for our Sunday dinner, a tradition that's held steady since that birthday dinner at Marcello's. Things aren't perfect. I'd be lying if I said all the hurt had magically healed. But they're different, and different is sometimes better than perfect. Jessica and I have an understanding now. She respects my place in this family, and I respect that she needs to be the primary mother to her child. We've found a balance that works. I have Lucas every Wednesday afternoon, but I always check with Jessica first. I offer advice when asked, but I've learned to bite my tongue when it's not. She includes me in holidays and birthdays without me having to request an invitation. Is she doing this out of love or out of fear that I'll take legal action again? Honestly, I don't know, and I've decided I don't care. At 75, I've learned that you can't control why people do the right thing. You can only appreciate that they're doing it. The storage unit remains. A quiet insurance policy neither of us mentions. The letter to Lucas sits there too, sealed and waiting. I've thought about destroying it a dozen times, but something stops me. Maybe it's my way of holding on to a little bit of power. Maybe it's my insurance that the real story will be told someday, not the sanitized version Jessica might prefer. Or maybe it's just because I've learned that being soft doesn't mean being weak, and being forgiving doesn't mean being foolish. Marcus has changed the most. He calls me twice a week now, not because he has to, but because he wants to. He started standing up to Jessica when she slips back into old patterns. And yes, she does slip sometimes. Old habits are hard to break. But now when she makes a possessive comment about her house or her decisions, Marcus gently reminds her that family decisions are made together, and family includes me. He's becoming the man I always knew he could be. It just took almost losing his mother to find that strength. Lucas turned 6 last month. The party was at their new house, smaller than the old one, but filled with more genuine warmth. Jessica made a point of asking me to help plan it, and I made a point of deferring to her preferences. We're both learning this dance of mutual respect, and it's awkward sometimes, but we're getting better. During the party, Lucas grabbed my hand and dragged me over to show his friends his grandmother. He told them proudly that I taught him about birds and how to grow tomatoes, and that I was the smartest person he knew. Jessica was standing nearby, and when our eyes met, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Genuine gratitude, not performed for an audience, but real. Maybe she's finally understanding what I tried to tell her that night at Marcello's, that accepting help with grace is its own kind of strength. I've revised my will one more time. The trust for Lucas remains untouchable. That's non-negotiable. But I've added back some direct inheritance for Jessica. Not much, but enough to show that I believe in second chances. The bulk still goes to Marcus, with provisions that protect against financial irresponsibility. But I've loosened some of the restrictions. Kenneth thought I was being too soft, but I reminded him that mercy isn't the same as weakness. Last week, Jessica asked if I'd teach her some of my recipes, the ones her children might someday want to make for their own families. We spent an afternoon in my kitchen, and she wrote everything down carefully in a new notebook she'd bought specifically for this purpose. She called it her Grandma Evelyn Cookbook and promised to pass it down to Lucas someday. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. She was finally acknowledging what I'd been trying to tell her all along. I'm not her competition. I'm her children's history. I'm the keeper of family memories and traditions. And pushing me away means pushing away part of what makes this family whole. I don't know how many years I have left. At 75, every day is a gift. But I know this. I spent most of my life being generous without demanding respect in return, and it nearly cost me my place in my own family. Standing up for myself, refusing to be dismissed, using every tool available to me, legal, financial, emotional, taught everyone, including myself, a crucial lesson. You can be kind without being a doormat. You can be generous without being exploited. You can love people fiercely while still maintaining boundaries they cannot cross. And sometimes, the people who underestimate you because of your age are the ones who need the hardest lessons. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And subscribe to this channel, because every grandmother has a story that deserves to be heard, and I have a feeling mine isn't the only one worth telling. We've lived through decades that younger generations can't imagine, and we've learned lessons that shouldn't be forgotten just because our hair has gone gray. Age doesn't make you powerless. It makes you experienced. And experience, my friends, is the most valuable currency there is.